McDermott, and this week I'm joined by the amazing Stu Fenton, who's joining us by the wonders of technology from, I was just about to say Scotland, because we were talking about Scotland before the show. No, he's not in Scotland. He's in Australia, which is a little bit further away. Just outside Melbourne, isn't it?
Yes.
Yeah. So welcome, Stu. Thanks for joining us. It's 8 o'clock in the morning over there or something. So
yes, 8 a.m. Pleasure to be with you.
It's great to have you. Last time I saw you was many years ago when we still had connections with people in real life. It just feels like everything's gone online. Just before we jump in and I introduce you properly, I just want to remind people this is a live show if you're watching it on a Wednesday at 9 p.m. GMT. And it'd be lovely to have your contributions. We stream on Facebook, on YouTube, and on Periscope, Twitter. So you can join us that way, or you can give me a call on the phone, which is 07506 319 745. Obviously, if you're calling internationally, +44 and drop off the sort of the first 0. You can call on WhatsApp, and you don't have to pay charges that way. So all of that done. Now let's move on. Coming back to you, Stu, welcome. You're a psychotherapist and you have a particular interest in looking at sex, sexuality, sexual functioning, chemsex, distorted sexual behaviours, and you've been working in that field for a long time. So we'll get into that. It's a fascinating area of work, and so far away, I think, from where psychoanalysis first started with Freud and his work on sex. And so it'd be really good to update the thinking around that, what's going on, because I think many of those misconceptions, or probably actually correct conceptions about Freudian sort of sexual beliefs, still sort of permeate out into culture. And but working in that area now is using modern techniques, and you've developed some new techniques, I know as well. It's very different from those days, so it'd be interesting to get into. Just want to catch up because we're still in this pandemic, and I'm sort of interested in how people have been managing in the pandemic, what it's been like. And I think it's a very different experience in Australia to the one that we're having in Europe. So how has it been for you this last year? How's it been going?
Well, it's been a bit of a roller coaster, but I feel very fortunate that I've been working the whole time, really. And just prior to the lockdown in Australia, I had finished working at the LGBT rehab in Thailand, and I was about to go on a 6-month, trip around the US and Europe. And I had only been in LA for 6 weeks before everything there shut down, and I was forced to come back to Australia, which was definitely not in my plan. Yeah. And so because I was kind of in holiday mode in my head, and then when I got back to Australia, I had to quarantine for 2 weeks, and like everyone, it's sort of like you have to reshuffle your life. And I had to go, well, what am I going to do? I was about to, be traveling on trains and enjoying the countryside, and I think I'm going to have to go back to work. So fortunately, this small city that I live in outside Melbourne has been funded for a therapeutic community, a drug rehab, since I went away. So I waited a couple of months just, because everything was shut down in Australia for 7 months. We had a quite serious COVID outbreak in Victoria, the state I'm in. And so we went through a very severe lockdown in that time. But very fortunately, I got the team leader position at this drug rehab and moved into that role, even though they were sort of screening the clients coming in, and even though it was a facility that had 20 beds, we were only really operating around 9 or 10, so for social distancing. But, I took over that role and started working there. And I actually started, some of my old clients for my own private psychotherapy practice heard I was back in Australia and wanted to see me, but I could only do that, through Zoom and Skype at the time. So, I wasn't particularly keen on starting up my private practice again straight away. I did want to have a break, but I did get quite a few requests for that. And I mean, the chemsex and sex addiction are not my only areas. I do quite a bit of drug addiction, codependence, and love addiction as well. So there's always people really screaming out for support around that. But the lockdown here sort of was released in November. So that was about 3 months ago. And things have gradually gone back to normal here, except for, you know, the wearing of masks and a few other things. So I've gone back to seeing people face to face in Melbourne. I operate my private practice on a Saturday. But I mean, having lived in Thailand, worked in Thailand, I still have quite a few international clients in New Zealand and Dubai and London. So, you know, the whole Zoom phenomena has been wonderful because it's, you know, allowed me to work with clients in all corners of the world. And at the same time, I'm sort of making my bread and butter team leading at this drug rehab here in Ballarat.
Yeah, nice. So it's a similar story, but I think at the moment, Australia is, like some other countries, has closed its borders and is free of the virus and intends to stay that way. Have you lot started this sort of vaccination program? Is that going on? Is that big news over there as well?
Well, what I keep wondering why they're not rolling it out here myself,
Right.
But apparently the reason is because COVID has been pretty much eliminated in Australia. There are a few cases. So, you know, most of the newspapers report that it's not as urgent as, say, as it would be in London or the US or some of the places where they're rolling it out now. So I do believe it's coming in April, and it's definitely going to happen, but it's not happening right now.
Right. I was just reading today sort of good news about the pandemic. There's been a sort of 17% drop in cases worldwide. So
Wonderful.
it really seems like we're turning the corner now, and lots of really, really positive news coming out, and it's great stuff. So I'm glad to hear that you're okay. I mean, it's just been such an unsettling year in so many ways, and certainly my experience in terms of the Zoom stuff has been, because I've always worked internationally anyway, so online work has been bread and butter. So there's been no sort of big. The interesting thing I've experienced, though, which is there's been a big conversation, I presume you know about this, about telehealth in general, meaning electronic health, not just telephone, but and actually we've just gone completely telehealth overnight in the UK. And we're not going back. And I don't just mean therapy, but like when I contact my GP, my doctor, for example, all of it's telehealth. And I don't think it's ever going back to sitting in a doctor's waiting room with loads of sick people again, because it's so convenient now. And there are a number of things like that sort of, the pandemic is awful and people have died and it's dreadful, that side of things. But there's a number of changes that it's accelerated, such as telehealth, working from home, and also pushing people to sort of seek psychological help with distress that they're experiencing, which I think are going to be permanent and are going to be positive changes. Have you experienced some of those things at this point? Would there be anything you would point to and say, well, this needed to change anyway, and this thing has just hurried it up?
For me, my primary qualification is Gestalt therapy, and so I would say I'm not a really big fan of the Zoom therapy for my practice, because I like to be able to incorporate chair work and experiment in what I do. It's so important for me to be able to read facial expressions, which is, on the Zooms, people are wearing caps and they're in dark rooms. And so that makes it quite difficult at times too. So, I did have a couple of clients who were prepared to do Zoom sessions initially, but, once the lockdowns finished, they really were keen to do face-to-face. And I have to admit, myself as well, I like to facilitate process groups and interpersonal groups as well. It can be done on Zoom, like with all the different tiles and people, appearing in that way. But for me personally, I I really love working face to face, being in the room with the person, being able to pick up all the really important cues that are necessary.
Yeah.
So, but at the same time, because of the pandemic and, the restrictions in place, I think being able to use Zoom as opposed to nothing at all has been a lifesaver for many, many people. And so, I do think it definitely has value in that sense. I would hate to think that I couldn't go back to face because that's what I love doing.
We want to get back to in real life as soon as possible, and all sorts of areas. I mean, I think there's plenty of evidence that backs up that the whole thing about mirror neurons and those being operated in real life and not necessarily operating across the telehealth. They don't. I mean, so one has to adapt practice to the medium, and certain things are lost, maybe certain things are gained. I mean, I think one of the gains is reaching out to disenfranchised groups, single parents, single mums in particular, who may be having issues and can't get childcare and be in their home and things like that. So. And isolated groups, farmers, where there's high risk of suicide and things like that. We've always known that, and I think the sort of enabling and extending the franchise is a good idea. But ideally we want a mix of both. I think, to be honest, it's sort of the great thing. I think one of the things that my clients have talked about is that it's cut down the amount of time that they need for therapy now, because they don't have the hour traveling to the office, then you do the hour, then the hour traveling back. And so they feel like they can commit a bit more. My feeling is that as we go forward, I think there's going to be a sort of mixed economy in it, and people will choose to do Zoom and then come into the office at certain points and see us face to face. And I mean, I think it's going to be really interesting looking at the inevitable research that takes place, both on the mental health impacts of the pandemic, which are relatively predictable, but also the responses and changes. And it's interesting for me, this is one of the few global mental health issues such as this, and I see it very much as a mental health issue, where we've actually had the technology to manage it and to provide services. And I think there's many years of learning to come about that and about what it means, and sort of really good insights into it. And because my sense is, I don't know what you think, the online world is going to grow. It's not diminishing. It's not going away. And it's going to have significant impacts on the way we are as a species, actually, I think.
Yeah, I do. It is one of those sort of very big moments in history that is going to create change. And, this is what everyone keeps referring to. And I always think that during the Spanish pandemic, there was like the Spanish flu, there wasn't this kind of technology or ability to do these things. So there wasn't that shift. But of course now there has been. And I think I agree. I think it's inevitable. And I also agree with you. I think, like, for example, with me, I've had a number of GP appointments, and, the vast majority of them have been through telehealth. Yeah. However, there are certain issues. You do need the doctor to actually be looking at your body up close. And so, I have had to, go in there in person. But I agree with you also that, like, there are times where, I have a very busy life. I go to work. I like to come home and go to the gym and do the shopping, whatever. It's very convenient to sort of jump in the car after work and get a phone call from my doctor and do the doctor's appointment driving to the supermarket, and have it all over in 10 minutes. And that's wonderful.
Yeah. I mean, I think my sense is what it's done is it's accelerated changes that were taking place anyway and may have taken the next 5 or 10 years, but they just had to happen overnight. And it's also that thing, I think psychologically, I'm encouraging people to not think about we're going back to normal. And there seems to be this hang up that people have. We're going back to, I don't think we're going back to anything. We're going forward into something. Yeah. And we need to sort of understand that. We also, I think, need to understand that the pandemic, although we will manage it, the virus itself isn't going anywhere. It's a natural phenomenon that's not just going to die out. It's going to join the rest of the viruses that, you know, quite happily sit in our bodies by the thousands. And we're going to have to sort of manage it going forwards. I'm really interested in what's going to happen with countries like Australia, for example, because your policy has been based upon closed borders and it's been very successful. But obviously we're connected. There are lots of connections in the world, economic, trade, etc., etc. So it'll be interesting to watch as the country comes out of that, how it manages the reopening of the borders, which is, I think, the stage we're at, which I'm very excited about. I'm really excited about this idea now that we're going to be putting in place things that allow travel again. You've mentioned several times that you have a broad sort of basis in addiction work, and when we were talking before the show as well, when we did our research chat, it's also about beyond addiction. But if you don't mind, let's sort of maybe go into and find out a bit more about you in terms of how you got into this field, which is in more general terms, addiction treatment, I guess you would.
Yeah,
correct?
yeah.
So
yeah,
talk us through that, how that happened.
Well, I guess I found myself experiencing an addiction problem in my late 20s in Sydney. I was living in Sydney. I was using crystal meth and GHB and party drugs, and you know, it actually all began for me with a romantic relationship. I'd met a guy. I was, you know, most of my life I'd been a very good boy from a good family, and I met this guy who was a sex worker and he was a prolific drug taker. Yeah. And so I sort of found what I was looking at in front of me very exciting, and it was a bit of a doorway to experience the bad boy in myself. So, you know, I took to taking drugs with him, you know, more frequently, and I started doing sex work as well. And, you know, you'd
had a very stable childhood, I think, hadn't you?
So very, yeah.
Almost idyllic in some ways.
Yeah, absolutely. I grew up on a farm. There were, you know, animals, and, you know, like I had my very loving mother and father, all that. So, yeah, it does seem a bit strange, like, how would that happen? I've done a lot of therapy over the years, though, so I do know the answer to that question.
Were they aware that you were gay? Were you aware that you were gay? Or?
I mean, I came out very late because I did grow up, my father was a footballer and a farmer, and he was very, very, you know, masculine. And so it kind of never crossed my mind that I could be gay. And, you know, it was only like when I was 20 years old and I'd wanted to become an actor, and I was working in a restaurant in Melbourne with a whole lot of very dramatic, you know, gay guys who invited me out one night to a gay club. And, you know, it dawned on me over a few weeks. I thought, wow, I think I might be gay, you know, but up until that point, it wasn't until, you know, it was in front of me and I was seeing men kissing one another and dancing together on the dance floor that I kind of wasn't repulsed by it, but really turned on by it. So, yeah, no, it was as much a shock to me. And I did come out to them when I was 20 years old, but they didn't take that very well. They, you know, they're both my parents are from isolated farming areas in Australia. So they had very, I guess, negative and backward views about homosexuality. But, you know, like over the years, they've adjusted. It's 30 years ago now that I told them that. But, yeah, I guess you know, through that journey, I ended up meeting this guy, taking the drugs, doing the sex work, and then the relationship didn't work out. So I started using more drugs to deal with my feelings. I didn't know how to deal with hatred or anger or pain or grief. And so I would use drugs. And then slowly, I became addicted to them. And, you know, by the time, that was when I was sort of 28, 29. By the time I was 32, I had a major drug problem with crystal meth and GHB. And I was, you know, overdosing and going to hospitals to be revived and having psychotic episodes on the crystal meth. So at the age of 33, I found my way into a 12-step program. and from there into a number of drug rehabs, and finally went to a long-term therapeutic community in Byron Bay, which is an idyllic setting above Sydney. And then by the time I was 34, I was sober, and I had developed an interest in rehab, watching Gestalt therapists work and other psychologists work in rehab. And I thought, wow, this is, I had been quite lost up until that point. I'd had a number of jobs. I'd done hospitality. I was a personal trainer, sex worker, school teacher, like nothing ever really kind of hit the mark. And then I just loved watching the therapists work with the clients in rehab. I was so incredibly impacted by my Gestalt therapist in rehab, who did chair work with me and provided me opportunities to engage in experiments with her. And she did a lot of inner child work with me. And it was so powerful. It was like, the most exciting thing for me since going onto the gay scene. It was a whole new scene. And so when I came, moved back to Sydney, I thought I might just study, some psychotherapy and stuff, and see if I can do this. And if I'm not, if I'm terrible at it, at least I'll be learning stuff along the way, about anger management and conflict resolution and all these sorts of things. And by the time I finished my first qualification, I got offered a job in another therapeutic community, and I thought, I'll try this out. And then I started my own private practice in 2008 in Sydney, and predominantly worked with gay men, who had the same issues that I'd had, because that was the field I was, most familiar with, like addiction and gay men's issues. And sort of took off from there. And by the time I moved to Melbourne in 2013, I'd sort of branched out. I'd gone to study with Pia Melody in Arizona, doing her post-induction treatment model, and I'd finished a master's in Gestalt therapy myself, and done like constellation therapy with Maria Dolenk, and I got really interested in Irv Yalom's style of interpersonal process groups. Like, I had really kind of spread my wings, and by the time I was in Melbourne, I almost had no gay clients left. I was inundated with straight men with drug problems, and a lot of women with love addiction and codependence, and then that's when I heard about sex addiction. I was at a conference in Arizona, and the majority of the people at this conference were sex addiction therapists, and I remember saying to someone, why is everyone here a sex addiction therapist? And they told me that it was the fastest growing addiction in the US, and that it would be a good field to get into because of internet and internet pornography. It was just sort of spiraling out of control. So I came back to Australia and signed up to study sex addiction with the Patrick Carnes ITAP group. And by the time I got offered the job in Thailand, I came to London and finished the last 2 modules of that and got qualified as that. So, most of my clients, to be honest, over the last few years have been straight males with their sex addiction issues, and, obviously working at R12 in Thailand, a lot of gay men and their chemsex issues, and also quite a few women, as I said, with love addiction and codependence.
There's a few things in there I might pick up on, if you don't mind. I mean, I think there's one thing is the whole notion of sex addiction, because it's a problematic notion, and particularly it's problematic within the gay male community. And there are a number of gay male therapists who are upset about that labelling, and they think that there's political issues going on in judgment of gay male behaviour. There's also the issue about whether, as a diagnostic thing, it doesn't exist in the diagnostic manual, sex addiction, and addiction itself doesn't exist in the diagnostic manuals. They tend to talk about other things, and I would like to talk to you about that, about why we use those words and the difference between that and the ones that exist in the diagnostic. So sex addiction doesn't exist, but you have this hypersexuality, and that's a disorder, and you have substance misuse disorders and dependencies, and so I think there's some interesting conversations there. But I want to go a little bit back in time. I was like, probably because you had to tell this story loads of times. But there was that thing and then I became a sex worker and and I mean, was it really that simple at the time? It was like automatic that's what was going to happen. And what was it like at the time? I mean, it might well have been because I know sort of in my 20s when I was exploring who I was, I got involved in the gay male scene in London, etc. I'm straight, but I wanted to find out what was going on, and I knew a lot of guys my age who were in the gay male scene, and they probably wouldn't have called themselves sex workers, but because they weren't walking the streets, but they were involved in relationships which involved them having sex with people for money, and often multiple partners. Like I said, they wouldn't have seen themselves in those terms at all. They were, and they were putting themselves at risk, as we know later on. So what was it like for you? I mean, was it that oh right, I'm gay and now I'm going to be a sex worker?
It's funny that you put it that way. I guess in some ways it was that easy, right. But I mean, the guy that I fell for, there are some times when you fall for someone in your life, or you think about that person, and there's probably 2 relationships in my life like that, where I would just do anything for that person, which is part of the issues I had to work through. But I had actually I was struggling with money in my mid-20s, and trying all these different things, as I told you, and nothing was really hitting the target. And there was, in the gay scene, I'm talking about the mid-90s, but there was a kind of like excitement around, this person is a well, sex worker is the term that we need to use today, obviously, but back then they would say hooker or prostitute or whatever, all these slang terms. But there was a kind of like
we had over here was rent boy.
Rent boy. I actually do like that term.
Yeah, I mean, that was the term that was used. It was sort of
But there was a kind of star quality to guys who were doing that, because they were usually young and they were well built, or they were well hung, or they were, like all these things. So I kind of, I had tried it before I met this guy just on one occasion, but I, was full of guilt, and I had all my own introjects about it and shame and whatever. So I tried it that one time. I loved the fact he gave me $300, but I thought, I can't do that again. It's against my value system. And then when I met this guy maybe 6 months later, who was, in front of my eyes doing it as a profession and making loads of money and having this wonderful lifestyle, it made it actually quite easy, because I was like, oh my God, here I am, working behind the desk at the gym for, $15 an hour, and he's making $300 an hour. So he kind of introduced me to it. I said to him, I want to have another go. He set me up with one of what he called his easiest clients. It was pretty straightforward. And, from then it was like, I was off and running. And also having someone in my, sidecar like him doing it as well. It was kind of like having a mentor, any worries or questions I'd have, he'd just give me really great advice. He'd say, well, don't see that client again if you feel that way, or, you need to be very direct and set boundaries with them, or, he'd been doing it for like maybe 7 or 8 years before I met him. So he was well versed in sort of the world of sex work, and it was a great mentor.
Right. And I guess there were must have been consequences for you that later on you faced, sort of psychological and also medical, I would imagine. So because.
Yeah, I mean, I think, it's funny because, I think back to my 27, 28-year-old self, and I feel I really grieve my beautiful, perfect body back then, and my healthy body. And I, for example, I'm HIV positive now. I wouldn't say that's a direct correlation to being a sex worker. I mean, that was more due to my addiction and, so many other factors. But in terms of physicality, there's quite you can't really be a sex worker without picking up a few STIs along the way and having some of those experiences. But they're all growing experiences as well. And mentally, I honestly, I'm not sure whether it had an impact on me or not, because, I always felt that I was fairly good with my boundaries. Yeah. I wasn't the kind of person who would use drugs to have sex with clients. So there was no fusion of drugs and sex work. So, I do think you have to have your head screwed on to do that work. I think you need to be very assertive and to choose your clients wisely. So there's obviously, I think the sex workers that have been around for a while and sort of know what they're doing have a much better time of it than the younger ones.
Yeah. And also, I mean, I think there's a big difference between maybe what you were doing and what happens if you're on the streets and you're having to do something and you have no stability. And
oh, absolutely, absolutely, yep.
Street work is a very different thing. And I know street workers often have higher rates of PTSD, for example, than soldiers, because of the dangerous sort of situations that they find themselves in. But it's interesting. It's also it's interesting, this sort of progression you had, where there were no obvious signs that, you know, none of the adverse childhood experiences pointing at, oh, addiction, sex work, that wasn't going to happen. It was almost like a lifestyle that you embraced in some ways, and this is where you went.
Yes, yeah. And you know, like I've never thought of it as a negative thing in my life. It allowed me the opportunity once I started university to fund myself in Montreal while I did an exchange program there. And, you know, it allowed me to travel around the world and even to put myself through university in Sydney when I decided I wanted to, you know, go back and study. And so for me, sex work has, I mean, and I think I told you in our prior conversation, the area I want to go into in the future is sex worker rights, transgender rights, and refugee, so in the refugee area. And one of the reasons is because I did have quite a few, well, I experienced, not only for myself, but for other people, the judgment and the stigma where people were, you know, that people experienced because of being sex workers. And I think a lot of this judgment comes from Western countries and white privileged people who don't understand that some people live in countries where the only work you can get is that. And if you don't do that, you don't put food in your mouth and you don't have a place to sleep at night. And people don't look at it through the lens of, you know, living in places like Nepal or Vietnam or Thailand or whatever. So it's, I really would love to, and I'm so glad I had the years of experience doing that, because I think it's going to inform me well when I do my master's in social work and focus on sex work, because I've lived it as well as experienced the stigma and the judgment against it. So, you know, I can't say there's
a really amazing organisation over in the UK called the English Collective of Prostitutes, which have been working for many, many years to improve the rights of sex workers in the UK. And they're extraordinary, actually, absolutely extraordinary group that I love very much. You know, trying to change the stigma around these, and get some legitimacy and some rights for people, because it's the street that kills people. It's not the activity itself. It's the exclusion and marginalisation that kills people and damages people, not the activity itself. And if it's well regulated and has good health care, like you say, I mean, and I also think that currently we've seen an explosion of it. And we were seeing an explosion of it before because of the use of online sex workers. It's huge now, and then the sort of rather sort of interesting term that's used, sugar babies and sugar daddies and all this sort of stuff now, that's used as a way of skirting around the more hardcore sort of words, which is, that's sex work, I'm afraid. That's what it is. And it's hopefully safe sex work, where the individual earning the money feels safe and empowered in the same way that you did, you know, and that's ideally what we want to see of it, because it's not like he's going away.
No, definitely not.
Let's get rid of that fantasy now. And it's really, I mean, I love the way you're presenting the experience and what the experience that you had, because I think that's really important to hear, that version of things which isn't moralistic, and also it worked for you in the way that it worked for you. Let's go forward. So you then find yourself, like a lot of people who are using too many drugs and too much drink, in problems. You have suddenly, oops, it's taken over, it's got a life of its own. And luckily for you, you found treatment, which took a while, but it worked for you. And then you got into training, which, you know, is a familiar route for many people. And you got interested in sort of sex addiction, as you say, chemsex, etc. So let's just talk about, you know, what on earth is sex addiction? And why do we use that term when it doesn't exist in any of the diagnostic manuals, for example? There's a big debate, I know, going on. And why is it that some gay male psychotherapists are wary of that term, sex addiction? So a number of questions there. Take them in any order you want.
Well, I think the addiction, the word addiction question is the most interesting one to me, because I really noticed that the most when I first went to Thailand 4 years ago, and I came to Europe to do the chemsex conferences in Berlin, and in they did another one in Paris in 2019. And you know, like, I am, from my lived experience and going through 12-step program and from working as a therapist, calling it addiction is just normal to me. But what I noticed there was each time I used the word addiction, people would correct me, or they would say things like, oh, we don't use that word, or I don't like that word, or whatever. So I became clear very quickly that this was a kind of movement that was going on. And I think, to be honest, I mean, this is only my personal opinion, I think that some people just have associations with that word that are very negative, you know, like whether it's probably historical. And for myself, I don't have that association with it, because I glided into 12-step program where people would say, I'm a recovering addict, or I'm an addict. And for me, I experience it as a very neutral word. I don't have images of, you know, like a very ill heroin addict with, you know, track marks in their arm. That's not what I think of when I think of an addict. You know, I guess I did so much study and so much reading about it that for me, really, an addict is just a person who repeatedly uses drugs to negative effect. And that is just a definition. But there does seem to be a lot of people out there who, for whatever reason, they think it's a derogatory word, they think it's a negative word, they think it's not, that it's harmful for people to describe themselves in that way. I think there's a history in 12-step programs where, you know, you identify and say, I'm Stuart, I'm an addict. And that is the norm in those programs. But for people who are not familiar with those programs, it hasn't been normalized for them. So they perhaps do attach negative connotations to it. So I would say that's why we these days get all these different variations on, you know, drug misuse, you know, condition, or all those kind of those words. I mean, none of it really bothers me. I mean, we're just describing the nature of addiction. And I'm not sure if you saw Gabor Mate's recent 10-minute clip on the definition of addiction. It's incredible. I just was so blown away. I love Gabor Mate, and he did a really lovely spiel about, you know, the definition of addiction by the World Health Organization or whatever is this, where it particularly sort of describes drugs being a part of that. And then he gave another definition from somewhere else that someone was using, which I thought, well, that's a little bit archaic as well. And then he gave his own definition, which was a little bit similar to the one I gave you earlier. Person repeats a behavior or use of a chemical on a regular basis, negative consequences flow on from that. And, you know, it's usually the symptom of the actual problem, and the problem is what needs to be dealt with in order for the addiction condition to be relieved. So, and that's been my experience in 15, 16 years in this industry, is that the people who are using an addictive process or a drug are usually only using that to deal with the problems that they're having. And, you know, as I told you, with my personal experience, you know, I had a loving family, but I did grow up not knowing how to communicate my feelings or express my feelings. I didn't grow up with great boundaries. My self-esteem wasn't great. I didn't know how to self-care or self-regulate. And these were all the things I became aware of when I was in treatment. Now, that's the stuff that was causing me to use drugs and to act out with chemsex. Yeah. It was actually fairly easy to give up the drugs and the chemsex. I mean, I wouldn't say too easy, but that was the first. It's taken a lot longer to deal with learning how to, establish boundaries, to understand my attachment style, to build my self-esteem, and to learn how to communicate with people and share my reality. That takes years. That's why that's the harder part. So I think, in a nutshell, that's why I think people really don't like, a lot of people don't like the word addiction.
Yeah. And why is it more problematic in the sort of gay male community? Why do some therapists there? I think I know an answer, but I'd like to hear your perspective.
Oh, I'd love to hear your answer. But if I had to say, and again, because I was going to these conferences, there were therapists there from all over Europe and many from London. And I agree with you totally. I think, my experience was the approach to chemsex in Europe is very heavily harm reduction. Yeah. And there is a lot of stigma in those circles and with a lot of UK therapists about the word addiction. And I would have to say that my experience was the therapists that came from 12-step backgrounds didn't have a problem with it. They were happy to use that word. The other ones who were more involved with harm reduction or, other methods like smart recovery and things like that, they were the ones that seemed to have a problem with it. I would actually also say that I think there is a bit of, with gay men, there's been a whole journey around, the shaming of our sex conduct and the ridiculing of our sex conduct and persecution. And then we went through this phase where things started to get better. Harvey Milk did what he did and was just such a wonderful idol. And then there was Stonewall and whatever. And then with AIDS, everything got shoved back in the closet, everything got pushed backwards. And there was shame and ridicule and they should die and all that kind of stuff. And then to be able to come through the whole AIDS epidemic and then come out the other side and we're now forming this, we're re-owning the word queer for ourselves and this sex positivity that's happening, that I think that a lot of LGBT therapists and activists are very hypersensitive to anything negative that is labelled to the gay community. So if people are calling chemsexes addicts, they'll put a stop to that straight away because we've been through so much suppression and persecution. Even the slightest use of a word like addiction, they're not going to have it. And that would be my other kind of possible thought about that.
One of the things I've talked to guys about, and it is guys, it's not lesbian women, but it's gay guys who are therapists, is, again, coming back to this early stuff about the beginnings of psychological therapies, Freud and Jung, etc. And within Freudian taxonomy, of course, being gay was a pathology, it was an illness. And it wasn't, it still was for a long time. It was only relatively recent that, being gay is no longer a mental illness. And in certain parts of the world, it still is viewed in those terms, but it's no longer in the diagnostic manuals. And I think there is understandably a caution about what sounds like pathologizing of something that actually can be all right. And that's what I love about your story about being a sex worker. People tend to automatically pathologize it. And you're saying, well, no, actually, it made sense to me. Yeah, there were consequences, but it made sense to me at that time. And I got a lot out of it and it helped me out a lot. And it's much more rounded and human. And I think the whole thing about sexual practices, whether they be hypersexual practices or whether they be BDSM, etc., and the challenges that provides to mainstream society that wants to view it as something that's dangerous, and all of that sort of stuff. And so I understand why people are a bit cautious. And with you, I understand the word addiction when it's being used by addicts as a reclaiming of something, as a positive affirmation of something. It's not outside of those contexts. I understand why people might find it uncomfortable. So it's thinking, some of my black colleagues who might use certain words that I wouldn't dream of using, but when it comes out of their mouths, it's fine. It's a reclaiming of their own personal history. I'm certainly not going to do it. And so, I understand that there's power dynamics around words, but it's interesting in your view as well. But I think, there is something about how words can empower and reclaiming words can empower people as well. And I think there's also, I agree with you, there's a political argument as well about who owns the field.
Yeah.
There's been a long debate between in certain forms of therapy about they say who owns the sand tray? Is it creative therapists? Is it play therapists?
Yeah.
Ongoing debate about it, and I think there's those types of debates, but actually ultimately good practitioners are doing pretty much the same. So how would you just very briefly define the difference between, I mean, you said it to some extent, but just to be a bit clearer about maybe the process that you go through, right, in identifying somebody that has, sexual behavior that other people think is a problem, but actually it's not really. And when it's become an addiction behavior that you think is relevant for treatment, is there a process that you go through with people?
Yeah, well, as I said, when I was in Thailand and I started to venture into working with sex addicts, they have quite a lot of diagnostic criteria in the Patrick Carnes model for doing that. And, they have a thing called a PTSIR, which is for trauma, I think. And I've forgotten the names because I haven't used them for a little while, but both of them, one of them indicates, if a person is a sex addict, so you answer a whole lot of online questions, and then if you get a score over 5, I think it's out of about 20 or something, then you're it's sort of suggested that you have sex addiction traits. I think it's really important that people sort of, are able to diagnose for themselves. What I found also really helpful in one of the texts that I was using was a criteria sheet of 10 different pieces of information, and they were things like, is the sex you're engaging in using up all your time and money? Do you wish that you were using the time, for other things like spending with partner and family? Do you feel conflicted and your value system is crossed each time you engage in these sexual behaviors? Have you ever harmed yourself physically through sexual behavior? And so one of the things I would do when someone was questioning whether they're a sex addict or not is sort of run these tests and go through these 10 criteria with them to be able to establish it. And, sometimes people would be sitting like right on the fence of that and not be quite sure, but it obviously never harmed them. What quite a few of them would do is they would go into Sex Addicts Anonymous or one of the 12-step programs and get a sponsor and start working on that, because it's not going to hurt to be able to develop a deeper and deeper awareness around this. And as you probably are aware, like whether it be sex addiction or drug addiction, there are sex users, sex abusers, and sex addicts. And so, I often have to spend a bit of time working out which category those people are in, because if they're a sex user, they're just engaging in sex with never any negative consequences, and I can remember myself, when I started getting into this, there was a part of me that was curious, like, am I maybe a sex addict? But once I'd done the tests on myself and explored it myself, I realized that I was very happy with my sexual behavior. It wasn't negative in any way, and I scored under 5 on the test. So it was really good for me to be able to get a really clear idea of, like, when is someone a sex addict? I think, where this becomes problematic with the LGBT community, especially gay men and men engaging in chemsex, is that because men are using drugs like crystal meth and GHB, which are drugs that make a man highly hypersexual, and that they go off and behave in ways where if they were to, go to engage in those diagnostic tests that I just mentioned, they would of course score as a sex addict and come up. And so that is one of the dilemmas when people are applying specifically Patrick Carnes's model to gay men. And I don't know that it's a really great model to use for gay men. And I know that there's an LGBT therapist in the US called Joe Court. I don't know if you've heard of him, but he's very anti the Patrick Carnes model for gay men. And also, I mean, there's a lot of politics involved here. People say that Patrick Carnes is quite religious, and a lot of the sort of the literature that he's created has a lot of religious overtones, which is much more specific to heterosexuals. And, it's very complicated. But I think that what I would often do in Thailand when I was dealing with chemsex men was, sort of try and identify whether their sexual behaviour that they were concerned about was existed before they started using drugs.
Yes. I see. Yeah.
And that's the best way. That was one of the best ways I was able to do it, because the majority of gay men would say, no, I was never like this when I wasn't using drugs.
Yeah.
And so, you know, give them the test again 2 or 3 months into treatment, and the results are quite different. And what I would find with, for example, the heterosexual males, like their sexual conduct was usually not on drugs. It wasn't that common. We would have a sex addict who also used drugs, but the ones that were non-drug users, their behavior, yeah, they would answer yes to those 10 diagnostic criteria, and they would score like a, 12 or 15 on the test. And it became very obvious that their sexual behavior was upsetting them, and that they were quite willing to, label themselves as a sex addict.
I mean, I think I'm with you. I mean, my sense is that the chemsex, it's the chem bit, it is the really problematic bit that pushes people over the edge. Can chemsex ever be safe, do you think?
Can it ever be safe?
Yeah. Are the people who are just users of it and they dip in and out? I don't know enough about it, but I mean, I think it's a really significant issue, the chemsex, the problematic chemsex use.
Well, yeah, I believe that it's just like I told you. I think within it are chemsex users, chemsex abusers, and chemsex addicts. Right. I think that obviously I've spent a lot of time in places where people are engaging in chemsex, and I have witnessed people who have very good boundaries, who don't take, very much drugs to do that. I've witnessed people who engage in the chemsex behavior not taking any drugs. So yeah, I do believe there are people out there who can engage in it. And a lot of what they do in Europe with the harm reduction, what I noticed at these conferences was they would offer them all these different harm reduction approaches and strategies to use while engaging in it. And I would say that they're more targeted at the middle category of person that is a chemsex abuser, to try and minimise the harm to them. And then, of course, there are the people in the third category, the addicts. Like that would have been me back in the day, because I was engaging in chemsex, but I was sticking needles in my arm, and I was overdosing on GHB, and I was becoming unconscious and being taken to emergency rooms to be resuscitated. Obviously, that's life-threatening. Obviously, that's someone who's a drug addict, a chemsex addict, and really needs a program to be able to heal and save themselves from imminent death. So I believe you have all three people engaging in chemsex. And I think one of the things that makes it really tricky is when people label chemsex as bad for everybody, which is, I don't think, necessarily the case.
Yeah, I mean, it's great talking to you, Stu, because I think that one of the things that was identified in the UK, I don't know if this is an experience that you have. I mean, what's great talking to you about it is that you're very clear about the different, the user, the abuser, the addict, etc. And that's a very clear methodology. You're obviously well qualified and well experienced, and you don't have a broad brush and just say, oh, you must be X, Y, and Z. And I think that's the worry that some people have about this term addict, that it gets applied too broadly and too loosely. And you're very clear about it. And sort of one of the things that's happened in the UK, Baroness Black was a baroness who did a review of sort of addiction, substance misuse, both the prevalence, and she looked across the board as well as the interventions. And one of the things, the conclusions she came to, which we've known for a while, is the dumbing down of the professional side of treatment, and that as budgets have shrunk, but also as all these unqualified coaches and life coaches and whatever have come into the field, and have just obliterated a lot of the professional practice, including this sensitivity around diagnosis. And certainly that was highlighted as the need to do something about it. Is that, you were nodding your head there, is that something you've experienced as well?
Can you be a little bit more specific about which part of that?
She was very clear that the professional standards within diagnosis and treatment had dropped significantly, and largely sort of because there'd been an influx of unqualified people into the field.
Yeah, look, definitely that's the case in Australia. I think, you know, I don't know what the versions that you have in the UK are, but here the most basic qualification you can get to work in the, you know, addiction field is a certificate 4. And, you know, once you have a certificate 4 or just a diploma, you can go and work in any drug rehab. And you know, yeah, I think that creates a lot of problems. A lot of people, you know, their hearts are in the right place. They want to get into the industry, you know, to help other people. But, you know, sometimes people are doing it because it's a way to mitigate shame and guilt, or, you know, there are also other reasons people are jumping in there to do it. And I've seen, to be honest, I've seen a lot of abuse in drug rehab, and the way that people are engaging with people, you know, their aggression, their delivery of information, and the transference that plays out unconsciously without them knowing. So I would agree with her definitely on that. And, you know, that was one of the reasons when I got into the industry that I chose not to do a certificate 4 initially. I mean, I already had a qualification from a previous bachelor's in something else, but I went straight into doing a graduate diploma in counselling, which was a much more kind of in-depth qualification before I went on to doing a master's in Gestalt. So I think that you know, I'm so glad that I dove in and did all that study and really sort of studied many different areas, because I think it has made me a very good therapist today, with a lot of empathy and a lot of ability to look through many lenses. Whereas, you know, I work in a rehab at the moment with a number of workers who only have the basic qualification, and I'm fine. I find myself cringing sometimes at how they engage with.
I get it. I mean, I think there's a big ghettoization process that's been going on for quite some time now professionally, and I often have people come up and talk to me who say, well, you know, I'm in recovery, should I go and train as therapist? And I say, well, that's a good idea, but don't train as an addiction therapist. Go and train, learn broader, and then if you want to specialize in that area, go for it. You know, not that I've got anything against specialist addiction training. I haven't, but it's a problem. And I also think the blanket imposition of the Minnesota model is so done now, and we just need to move on from that. And one of the things I like about you is that you're sort of thinking about new models of practice and that you'll bring them in. Gestalt is, you know, it's close to my heart, Gestalt. I originally trained in arts therapies, particularly drama therapy. So the more active, the use of the chair, role play, role changes, all of that sort of stuff. I mean, I think I'm with you, and the kinetic approach. I'm definitely with you. You know, we are whole bodies. We're not just minds, and utilizing those things. One of the things we did talk about, because we're running out of time, unfortunately. I could go on for hours with you.
Yeah.
But we are running. I want to bring us up to date with you, and not just what you're currently doing, but what your plans are, and this whole concept of like that we were talking about in our telephone call about beyond addiction. What does that mean? Again, my heart is with you on refugees. I worked with them so long here in the UK that it's just has to be done, you know. So tell us about this, where, I mean, once you have the freedom to move and you're sort of then following your heart, where is that going to take you?
Well, my plan has been for the last 5 years, I really want to move to Berlin. I just love this interesting city that has so much history. You know, I always see Berlin as a person, you know, that was a bit of a bad boy and, you know, got into a lot of trouble and sort of got humiliated and had to, you know, regroup and begin again. And now it's such a vibrant, exciting, interesting city with people that have hopefully learned from the errors of the past. So they're a bit like a recovering addict themselves. But I love Berlin for that. But so I want to go there and do a master's in social work at Alice Salomon University. And that's what I'm working towards right now. And my reason for doing that is because, you know, I have worked in addiction for a long time, but, you know, just I want to work with the sex workers and the transgender rights and also refugees, but for all different reasons. Like, for sex workers, because there were a couple of situations during when I was a sex worker where I was stigmatized and judged for what I was doing. And I just realized there are people in the world who sometimes don't have a choice but to do anything but sex work, and they're really up against it. There are huge rates of murders and stuff with women sex workers throughout Europe and the UK, and that needs to stop. And it's because they're not being protected. And I think with transgender rights, that's become very interesting to me. You know, obviously transgender have become so much more visible in the last 10 or 15 years. And I've had a number of friends and a number of clients that have been transgender. And I just think they're the bravest people on the planet, you know, to come out and to live their lives in a way that feels right to them. But I've also, you know, witnessed so much cruelty and evil and, you know, judgment of those people. And I would like to be a part of something that makes their lives a little easier. And finally, with my interest in refugees is 18 months ago, I met a Venezuelan guy. We started a relationship. We've been together for 18 months, but, you know, we've been separated because of COVID and everything for the last 12 months. But you know, I speak to him morning and night, and you know, what I've noticed is how disenfranchised and how difficult it is for them. It was already without the COVID pandemic happening, but you know, he's in a European country right now. He has no government support. Like, I came back to Australia, instantly received $750, started being paid, you know, a certain amount of money per fortnight. You know, healthcare. I had it all given to me on a silver platter. Like, I'm the luckiest man in the world here in Australia. But what I noticed as my partner was literally struggling to eat and couldn't go to the doctor when he had illnesses, wouldn't go to the dentist when he had dental problems. Like, the list goes on. My heart was breaking. And, you know, I've never really even thought about the refugee situation. And the more I read about Venezuela, and I heard about, you know, 20 million Venezuelan people roaming the world, homeless, and the madness that has taken over their country. And then I thought, well, it's not just Venezuela. There are other, I'm getting a bit upset actually, but, you know, like, there are so many Western countries that are that just sort of are so unaware of what it's like for people in those countries. And what makes me more angry is when people are very rude and judgmental and talk about refugees and, like, you know, they shouldn't be here or they shouldn't go there, and why don't they stay in their own country? And it just makes me sick, you know. Like, we have to be able to make the world a better and safer place for refugees.
It's especially important to hear an Australian accent saying that, because there's been a lot of criticism of Australia in the past around refugees, but also a lot of criticism in Europe of the response in Europe. And it's been, I mean, I remember I first started working with refugees in the 90s, and the treatment of refugees is, you know, it's not improved at all since then. You know, like, it was so bad that it wasn't safe for me to tell people that that's what I did, because I would literally be threatened as for whatever reason. I don't quite know why people were wanting to threaten me, but they were so angry about things. But they were, you know, I met some of the most extraordinary people that stay in my mind today, people who've been through things that are unimaginable, but still were getting on with their life. I remember, if you don't mind me telling you a story very briefly, I met a woman who had been in the rape camps in the Balkans during the war. She was a Muslim woman, and I was sort of talking to her about the fact that she was going to return because apparently the Balkans were pacified now, everything's all right. And she was very upset. She had a daughter next to her. And this Muslim woman was, you know, beautiful, dark skin, dark hair, dark eyes. And her daughter was 3, 4, blonde, blue-eyed, obviously a product of the rape. And she was facing so-called honor killings going back home, but that was fine as far as the government. And yet there was this extraordinary moment when I was talking to her about this, and I was reading her report, a medical report, saying that the broken bones were consistent with rifle butts and things like that. And she was holding on to this report like it was, biblical, and this should have helped stop her going. And her daughter noticed that she was upset and started looking at her and crying, "You're right, mummy." And mummy immediately switched into being mum, and she turned to her daughter and she says, "All right, darling, don't you worry, she's fine." She gave her a hug. And I was thinking, well, that's extraordinary that this woman was able to turn and meet that little girl's needs. I'm not sure I'm that brave. I'm not sure I'm that strong. I'm not sure I'm that courageous. Do you know what I mean? And sort of, and people don't see that. What they see are the sort of trashy media images, whatever. But not that extraordinary, courageous human spirit, which I saw huge amounts of. I agree with you about the trans stuff. I mean, it's so nice that the Orange Monster was gotten rid of, and that that America immediately reversed that dreadful ban, and that human rights are coming back in. And again, first time I met somebody who was trans was when I was first starting my practice, and I had no idea he was trans. He'd been born a woman and then done the gender reassignment surgery, and I was chatting away to him, and it somehow came up in the conversation. I was like, oh wow. So long time ago, but really courageous stuff. He had the funniest line that I've ever heard, because he transitioned from female to male, and he was had been in a lesbian relationship, and now was with the same woman, an apparently heterosexual relationship. And he said, "I'm the oldest virgin in Glasgow." Brilliant, and that is wonderful. That sort of stuff. Anyway, I wish you well, Stu. It's been really, really amazing to catch up with you. Thank you. And I sort of really enjoyed our conversation. I hope we can do it again. I hope you feel that you would want to come back, because I'd love to carry on and talk more about the clinical side of things. I'd love to talk more about your actual practice and the Gestalt and how that works, and and those sorts of things. If people do want to get hold of you, do you have a website we can sort of promote for you, or is there some sort of contact details somewhere?
Yeah, absolutely. The web, I've got a few websites, but the two main ones are stufenton.com.au or beyondaddiction.net.au.
Okay, well, we'll put those out and give the links to people. And it's been lovely to see you again. It's been ages, and I hope you'll come back on the show and keep us updated in the work that you're doing. Good luck in this period, and of course, when you get to Berlin, give me a shout. I'll jump on a plane, we'll grab a cup of coffee, and by then we'll be allowed to do those things. Lovely to have you on. I'll say goodbye to everybody for now. You stay with us for a second, Stu, and thanks everybody for joining us this week. See you all next week with a guest whose name I don't know, but I'm sure my team will tell me at some point who it is. So bye-bye, and thank you all for joining us.
Thank you.